Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Today's episode is on science communication with guest speaker Élodie Chabrol. So Elodie did her PhD in neurogenetics at Descartes, Paris, followed by two postdocs at UCL studying the peripheral nervous system and epilepsy. And now Elodie is primarily a science communicator, and she's the co-founder of EU Beyond Research and the French brand of Pint of Science, which is super exciting. And she designed and developed the communication strategies and developed several events in France, amongst many other science communication projects, such as podcasting, volunteer work, and consulting. Welcome to the podcast, Elodie.
Hi, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. I would like to start off with the basics. So I would like to ask you what got you into science and neuroscience, and then what caused you to transition into being a science communicator.
So I always wanted to be a teacher since I was a kid. And I was actually riding horses, and I wanted to be a riding teacher for a very long time until I was 17 years old and I broke both of my knees in the same summer. And then basically I was not able to do riding anymore. So I had to decide on something else. And naturally I went to science because I think since I'm a little kid, I'm always interested. I'm this annoying kid that always asks why. Why is it like that? Why is the sky blue? Why is blah, blah, blah? And I had this grandfather that raised me that was a painter. And, he loved to show me nature, like little animals, little plants, sitting in front of the sunset for hours. And I think that really built some kind of awareness on nature and how pretty it was. So I think I've always been interested in that, but I didn't know. So I was in high school, and I have both of my knees completely messed up, and I decided let's go for biology because I loved not just science, but specifically biology. I was really not good in physics. So I went for university degrees, and I really wanted to be a teacher. So there's this office in France, orientation office. You can go and you can tell them, I want to do that kind of job. How do I do that? And they said something that was completely inaccurate and absolutely legendary. They said, it's quite created to be a teacher in France. You have a contest, and some people do some schools and are trained for it. It would be easier if you do a PhD. There is no competition. And I was like, okay, I trusted them. And the first thing is that when you do a PhD, you have a competition to get a grant. So I was like, oh, before the PhD, you have a competition. And it's super competitive. So I didn't, work completely wrong, but that got me into a research lab. I didn't know research, I never had anyone doing research around me. And I think when I was younger, a long time ago, research wasn't something that we were close to. Science communication wasn't so big. You couldn't really meet scientists as much as you do now. I discovered research in first years of master. I entered the lab the first day of my training, and I had this amazing boss during my first training, and it just got me hooked on research. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do a PhD, and I'm not sure I'm going to be a teacher. There is this position in France that is half lecturer, half researcher. So I was like, this is perfect. I want to do that. And I continued research. I actually did neuroscience because I wanted to do genetics. I started genetics in master. I hated neuroscience when I was in lectures, and this position was offered to me, and I was like, actually, it could be quite cool. And then I got hooked up on the brain. I feel like it's a series of lucky mistakes or lucky, moments where I was not really meant to do something, and I actually ended up doing it. So I did a PhD in neuroscience, epilepsy. I really loved it. And then I went into the sciatic nerve for my first postdoc. And actually, I felt a bit restricted because, the brain is so big, it's so interesting that when I went into nerves that were just, the ending part of the nerves, that I felt a bit like, oh, I'm restricted now. It feels like it is super interesting, but the brain was so much more. So I went back to epilepsy after that.
That's such a good story. And it really is like a series of coincidences, but I also can definitely relate to certain things that you said, like your love for nature or your grandfather teaching you about nature. I think my love for biology definitely stems from being in awe of nature and wanting to study that. And also about the central versus peripheral nervous system. Like I spend so much of my time studying the brain, and every time I study anything related to peripheral nerves, I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this? This is so totally different.
Yeah, it's completely. And if you want a small anecdote, actually,
Yeah.
I realized that I think a year ago or 2 years ago. So, before the biology books and all the books were actually with hand drawn from painters or drawers, it wasn't done like graphically by computer like now. And I realized that actually, since I'm a kid, my granddad, he did some biology books on forests, on like all the animals and plants and everything. And I completely forgot about that until 2 years ago or last year, where I thought, oh, I should try to see them on eBay, on sites to find them again. And I got them back and I was like, okay, I realized now that since I'm a kid, I'm actually looking at those biology books and, plant books, animal books from the mountains and the forest and everything. And it's been there all along for me. And maybe that's why I'm so interested in biology, because I had that all along, but I didn't know. And I realized that last year. I was like, oh, mind blown, actually.
That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have had a really deep influence on you, even though you didn't even though you weren't aware of it consciously. And
Yeah.
it's amazing how all of these happy coincidences or happy mistakes led you to where you are. And I think something you mentioned, that you had a really good boss, and that was like
Yeah.
a really amazing first experience of working in a lab. And Tara and I both know that that makes such a big difference in terms of whether it does ignite your spark for something or not. And also interesting how you said that in the beginning you were misinformed as to the route of being a teacher, which definitely ties into what we'll speak about later on in terms of science information and communication. And so did your wanting to be a teacher then lead you to pursue science communication after your postdocs?
So, yeah, actually, I didn't say how I ended up doing science communication. I got an email from Pint of Science being created like a month after starting my second postdoc. I always loved communicating about science and organizing stuff. So I was like, okay, I will just join. I called them and they said, okay, you have the UCL coordinator, so coordinating all the events for Pint of Science at the UCL University. So it was 3 teams and 3 different sets of bars. And I said yes, and I joined and I loved it. And it's funny because I realized years later that it's actually everything I love. So it's like kind of teaching, but not in a way like courses, but it's more like explaining to people how cool science is while learning about science. So I felt like, bit by bit, I finally found my perfect spot, where I'm teaching and not teaching. I'm actually now teaching scientists how to communicate about science. And I do like 200 hours a year, which is quite a lot. So, I found a spot. I think I kind of created a spot where, it's perfect for me. It's like my dream job.
That's amazing. Yeah. And can you, for our listeners, explain a bit about what Pint of Science is?
Yes. So Pint of Science has been created really like a festival. So like a festival of music, for example, a few days, an overwhelming number of events happening in different places. And the idea is that we're doing 3 nights in May, always in May. We have scientists in pubs during 3 nights speaking about their research in lots of different cities in UK, but also lots of different cities in the world. So we don't have the exact numbers for 2023, but we're going to have around 400 cities and 26 countries.
Wow.
So, and it's simultaneous. So it means that the same 3 nights, you are going to have thousands of events everywhere in the world. So I think it's probably going to be like 1,000 per night or something like that.
Wow, that's so cool. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it is amazing. And so it's every year. It's really, like I said, a music festival, but it's really at the same 3 nights. So it's kind of when I think about it, I'm like, every year I'm quite proud because it's very difficult to organize everyone. And also it's, the atmosphere that we have in the pubs and the way people can approach scientists that is very different from conferences. It's really more like cozy. You can actually maybe go and have a drink with the scientist at the end. People ask questions that I've never seen asked in conferences.
And did you, in the past, you find that most of the audience are non-scientists then? Yeah.
I'm the international director, so every year I'm helping new countries create the festival. And it's funny because we always see the same development. The first year you have mostly scientists because scientists are organizing it. It's mostly like network, word of mouth. And then you expand to more people. You have also media that hear about you, and then they can help you have more non-scientists. And then usually we reach some kind of plateau of like 50-50. But the scientists coming, they are going to other subjects. In France, for example, 2/3 of the scientists are going to something else, because probably the third that is going to do the same thing, it's to support their colleagues talking. And the other ones that are going as attendees, they like to go to something that is completely different.
Yeah, that sounds great. It's such a creative but good idea to have that sort of informal setting. Yeah, absolutely. I do find that like when I explain science to non-scientists, everyone is always really interested. And I think that there's somewhere along the way in the education system that people kind of end up having this perception of science that it's unreachable. And I really like the fact that this really bridges the two worlds, and it allows people to ask silly questions or personal questions. And when you ask a scientist, like, why did you decide to study this, or why is this your research interest, you really see them shine. And I think that it's really rewarding to see that.
I think it's education system, and it's also when you look around, and if you see, to me, like in the pop culture, if you look at scientists, it's always going to be people that have a weird language or that look super nerdy. When there is a scientist in a movie, you could just not put any sounds, any dialogue. You would point that person because that person has glasses or look completely nerdy, or and I think it's just building this this kind of cliche that scientists have to be unreachable, that they are necessarily complicated and hard to reach and not normal people. I remember when I was single in London and I was dating, I always had people being like, "Oh, you don't look like a scientist." I'm just like everyone else, And I think in the culture, scientists are weird, unreachable, inaccessible, speaking with a weird language kind of people. And it's nice to have them represented at Pint of Science and to see that, to show that they can be anyone. And we have lots and lots of PhD students, which I love. Because when we started, it wasn't such a big thing to do communication when you were a PhD student. It was more for the experts, so the old and the senior PIs or the senior researchers. And now you have lots of initiatives for PhD students. But 10 years ago, it wasn't the case. And it was super nice to feel like they are included.
Yeah, this leads me to two questions I had, or things I wanted to talk about. One is, so the inaccessibility of science issue highlights the importance of using quite like different creative ways to communicate science. And I remember in a previous conversation we had, you mentioned a couple of examples like the Science Gaelic using dance and music, and the Tacti universe to use touch to. So I was wondering if you want to talk a bit about this.
So I think when I started science communication, you could clearly see that it was like the old school model, like 10 years ago, where before it was mostly radio, books, journals, and television. And it was very like scientists informing the population, and it wasn't really a dialogue. It was just like that. And I think the people that are not interested in science, some are not interested, and it's complicated to get them interested, but some others are not interested. They are just not reached by some ways that we use conventionally. And I think in science communication, lots of people are getting very creative. Before we thought the general public, like one thing, and we are trying to reach the general public, but I'm always trying to say there is no general public. There are communities and tons of different bubbles of general public, and some might be interested in music and dance, so Science Gaelic is amazing for that. It's an initiative that basically explains science with dance and music, basically an amazing thing, thinking, okay, they love dancing and music, we are gonna try to find something that they like and approach them with what they like, instead of like trying to force science into people. We're like, okay, you like music and dancing, why not do that? And Tactile Universe is the same kind of idea, except it's more to make astrophysics accessible to vision impaired people, blind people. And it's basically an initiative where they print 3D cards, 3D blocks, sorry, with like galaxies, and then they explain to people. And I've done it as a non-vision impaired person. And it was an experience that was amazing. You know, I was blindfolded and they walked me through the 3D stuff and discovering galaxies and space pictures with the touch. It was incredible. And this is the idea of, you know, thinking, how can we reach people that would not be reached, and not just, you know, think, oh, too bad, you cannot really see well. Well, astronomy is not for you then. You know, trying to be like, okay, if it's not the case, how can we make it accessible? And I'm deeply in awe for those initiatives, because I find it amazing to really try to find a way, you know, to reach people and include them, because sometimes you're not interested in science just because you didn't have the possibility to learn science, or it's not necessarily been presented to you in a way that was the way you actually like, you know?
Yeah, and that actually reminded me of similar to our conversation. We've had a science art duo on our podcast before, Tact, and they create kind of experience, like science art experiences to convey science to the public through art. And they've had exhibitions about like emotions, for example, using sounds and visual stimuli to stimulate like different emotions in people. And so it's a very much more experiential way of discovering science. And so that reminded me of these sorts of initiatives where it's a completely different way of understanding science. And the point isn't just to learn facts like it was back in the day with science communication, but it's more to question what is science and what is it to see the world through these different lenses. And that was also a perfect answer to my first question, because it also addressed my second question, which was going to be about how has science communication changed over time. So it's great to hear.
Yeah, I actually have 2 points to add to that. Pint of Science, we have a branch that is called Creative Reaction, and that's actually the idea of having scientists and artists working together to create some kind of science and art, either exhibition or presentation or talks, you know.
Related to what you were both talking about in terms of how science communication has changed over time, and all of these artistic angles on science, I think it's so positive because it really brings to the core of what science is for most scientists. It usually is born out of a place of curiosity and wonder for the world, a place where the methodology and the science itself are intrinsically rewarding, and it's not being portrayed in such a dry way, in such a lectury way. Now, the way that science is communicated is more representative of what science feels like, because I think with most scientists that do want to communicate science is to help others enjoy this feeling of wonder and curiosity and being intellectually stimulated. And this brings me to a couple points, and that for me, that's one of the goals with the podcast. And we've spoken about this with another episode that we did with Alex, in that there are a lot of echo chambers in the world. And the thing that I like the most about podcasting is that it brings the private public. And so instead of knowledge, curiosity, and wonders and all of these amazing things being limited to a lecture hall, like now we are able to bring it to a wider audience, bring it to anyone that has access to a phone or internet. And I think I really enjoy that about the podcast. With almost all of my friends, I always tell them about patching, and they're always fascinated by the methodology of it and how I think all science can be explained clearly and plainly. And when we do that with people that aren't in our immediate circles, non-scientists specifically, I think, it's an amazing way to engage.
It is. But sometimes people don't let you do that. Sometimes they're like, oh no, it's going to be too complicated. So you have to convince them to listen to you. It's like, no, trust me, I can do it. I can do it. Please give me 2 minutes. Science communication, and especially Pint of Science, one of the goals is exactly what you said. It's not necessarily to inform. I don't necessarily want people to remember facts when they come home, but I want to spark some curiosity for science.
On the topic of science communication, I think another aspect of it that is incredibly important, not just for engaging and stimulating the general public and scientists alike, but also when it comes to policy making, and how I
Yes.
think that it's incredibly important to have good science communicators so that policymakers and the general public can make informed decisions about their health and about practices that should be implemented. I think that if we don't do that, and it's a bit like, oh, just listen to the authority, full stop, we fall into a bit of a Orwellian kind of dystopia. And we spoke about this with Alex as well, in that it's almost like a religion. Back in the time that the priests would preach in Latin and would be like, well, just believe that this is what is right. And I think that everyone has the right to make an informed decision. And I do think that's on us to be able to communicate it effectively.
Yeah, I think there are several things. So it's important for science communicator to help, but also I think in France we have this debate like all science should do science communication or learn how to do it versus not everyone should do it. And I think at least every scientist should have like basis of communication, because they might be asked by a journalist or whatever some questions, and you don't want to end up like in a movie Don't Look Up, where you bury very important stuff in overly completed details that make the message go completely wrong. So first, it's very important that scientists have like, just a basic thing so they can kind of know how to deal with communication if they have to, not necessarily force them to do science communication all the time, but have a basis. And also make scientists visible, because I don't know how it was in the UK, but in France during COVID, we always had the 2 or 3 same scientists talking, and you had like a philosopher talking about virology, and it's like, why that person? It's not the most the best person to talk about that. And I think we need to show that science is not. I think people think scientists know everything about everything, and it's important if journalists know who to contact. I want someone talking about virology. It's not the same that if I want someone talking about climate change, and I'm going to go to 2 different people, not just the very widely used people that are always the same. And you see on TV talking about like everything. You see them when it's about COVID-19, when it's about climate change, when it's about whatever, it's the same person. So I think it's important to change the culture as well, and it's coming. It's just that scientists usually are quite unreachable in the labs. Like on Twitter, what I love to do are lists, and I love to tell people those are lists. Those are lists of, like, for example, women scientists in France. If you want to have more women represented on journals and TV, or this is a list of neuroscientists that you can ask around about things. And I think it's on science communicator and on scientists, and it's coming. It's just that it's fairly new to have so many scientists talking about their research and to have so many science communication. And I think at the moment it's a bit chaotic because, you have the old way of doing it versus the new way, but not everyone's doing the new way yet. And it's getting there. You have grants asking for science communication, but labs don't know really where to go. That's why we created Beyond Research, actually, to help big consortium in Europe.
And yeah, I think what you said about it's always the same people in the media, that's really true. And I think COVID also taught us how much people kind of put weight on what scientists say. Because I remember like there would be one virologist who would say something about some vaccine, and then everyone would trust that one person, even though other virologists disagree. And I think something that's so big in science that scientists are very much aware of, but the public may not be, is the disagreements that happen in science. There's always disagreements between scientists, and it's that philosophical approach of that's how knowledge progresses, by questioning and challenging each other. And so it is important to have like a larger variety of science communicators in order to get that message across, instead of, again, like back in the olden times when it was just facts. That really relates to the next thing I was going to say, which is, as much as it's the scientist's responsibility to be able to communicate well, etc., I think it's very much a two-way relationship with the public, in that, for example, with the example of COVID, a scientist would say something, and then later on, when we've updated on the facts, he would say something different. And the public were very quick to crucify these people. And I think that we need to be a bit kinder, but also understand that that's the nature of knowledge, that we update our information. And if anything, it would be concerning if scientists didn't update their information and just kept banging on the same story, you know, that would be more concerning. I think it's a show of strength and integrity when we do change the narrative of the story, when we do update the facts, because we are trying to have everyone's best interests at heart, and we are being honest and humble. So I think that it's a two-way relationship in a way, and that, yes, we need to communicate things better, but the public should also realize that when we do update the facts, that we are being truthful and it's more beneficial.
I think, and it's what we're trying to do as well, more in science communication, I feel, is that the amount of information compared to 10 years ago or 15 years ago is dramatically different, because now we have social media. And before, we used to just communicate on the big discoveries. You know, science felt like people always asking you, what did you discover? You know, it was all about Nobel Prizes and big discoveries and nothing in between, like, you know. And more now, and actually this is the thing I'm trying to teach people, teach scientists, is that the scientific method is very important to know as well. And it might be more important to teach than the actual science facts. So when I was doing talks for my postdoc, for example, I love to show people one graph and explain, you know, this is the results of my postdocs. This is a gene therapy thing. So you see, when we're using the gene therapy, the animals have less seizures, so it's a win. But I was trying to explain, this graph is 5 years. How is it possible? And I was really explaining the method behind the fact that when you find something, you have to redo the experiment a number of times to make sure that it's actually true. And, you know, I was really trying to explain the scientific method, you know, being skeptical a bit as well with whatever you read. And I think more and more now science communication is also about teaching how to be skeptical about what you read, you know, have a critical mind, and how the scientific method works, which is amazing, because this is the problem, is that, you know, we take for granted what people are saying. And yes, science, the facts, it's basically whatever we know at the time with the technology we have. But tomorrow we might have another technology that might update the facts, and it doesn't make it less true, or we cannot have trust in scientists. It just means that, yes, science is moving forward, and with moving forward, we have new information. And as you said, it's amazing if actually people can update. But if you don't know how it works, you're going to feel like, if they update, how can I trust it's true?
Yeah, and this is something I think we try to convey in Neuroverse, because like we just did an episode on scientific methods to study neural activity, and how you're always kind of limited to understanding where the neural activity occurs, or when, like spatial versus temporal.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking to some people about this, and they were like, oh, but why is there always this trade-off between spatial and temporal resolution? And so we were like, well, this is why we need to do an episode on it, because yeah, like scientific tools, they are limited, each in their own ways, and but they can also each tell us different things, and it depends on the tools that you use. And yeah, you're right, this is important to inform people about.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, you know, if you want to know a city, you cannot just take one picture and say, oh, this is how the city looks like. You need several pictures from different angles, from different places, and then you might actually create a map of the city, or know how the city is. It's exactly the same with science. Everyone, or like a puzzle, you know, everyone is taking a bit of it, and with everyone's view and everyone's technologies, then you can find things.
Related to what you were talking about, the scientific method, I think absolutely that's so important. And it's something I hadn't thought about, but it's definitely true that almost more important than communicating science is communicating the scientific method, because then each person can critically evaluate the information that is given to them. But also, I realized from talking to non-scientists how people sometimes have such a misguided opinion of what is happening in academia. So like I've heard people say, have the impression that academics are lazy and that they just chill and don't do anything with their time, when we all know that it's a pretty much a 24/7 kind of job. Like, we're always on the clock, we're always researching. But then people ask, but then why does it take years and years and years to publish? And it's because we are so rigorous. And like you said, like 5 years of work can end up being summed up in a graph. And so I kind of wanted to communicate that the reason scientists take a long time to publish is not because we're lazy and swimming in like buckets of money, but because we are extremely rigorous and skeptical of our own data and results, and we want to make sure it's accurate, because we know that mental effects it can have if it's not.
Or because we're trying to actually use the little money that we have to use the most efficient, like, sort of method with that money. And that sometimes takes a while to get to the results that we need.
Yeah, and in some fields like biology, for example, if you work with cells or animals or all that kind of thing, that's going to take even longer, because cells, they might die. Like, that was the fear of every Monday morning, that I would have my cell cultures infected with some bacteria or fungi or whatever, and that I would have to restart my experiment that was going on for 3 or 4 weeks. I've put so many of my month of work in the trash bin.
Yeah.
Especially, cell culture. You arrive to the lab, you're like, okay, 2 months of work in the trash bin. This is fine. This is a typical Monday morning in research. And then you have to start and do it all over again. And yeah, so basically this experiment, I can do it only like 4 times a year or something, and it takes a long time. And yeah, so that's why it's also very important to explain how you do it, because I feel like most of the people don't know. And when I was in PhD, for example, and I was with my fiance, and 1 week I had to do temporal points where I had to get cells every 2 hours for 24 hours. And he didn't understand that I had time for lunch, because I basically went to the supermarket, I bought something, and I called him and I was like, oh, it's my lunch break. And he was like, but you're going to work all night. Couldn't you not have a lunch break and like finish work earlier? And I was like, oh, okay. He's living with me. I explained to him what I was doing, and he's still telling me that I'm lazy to go out to get lunch while I could be working, but I cannot, because I give something to my cells and I wait for them to biologically react. And then I have to get them, and it's every 2 hours, whatever I do. So if I work in between, it's not going to make it faster. And, I was like, is my fiance is living with me, and I failed explaining to him how it works. So someone that doesn't have a scientist in their lives, how must it be? So this is why it's so important to try to explain that to people.
Yeah, so the message of this episode is to find a science friend to explain it to you. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
I just wanted to say, though, that I had the same experience. I know that in cell culture, it's particularly prevalent because you really need to take care of your cells and, like, feed them what they need and keep them alive. But I did a short project looking at sleep in mice. And so I had to basically like record neural activity with all these different time intervals. And they were like 3 hours or 5 hours or 7 hours. And so I like interleaved all of the recording sessions. So like I would have one mouse and then another mouse and then wait a couple of hours and then record from. And it was so much organization. Like I had to really make sure that I knew what was when and the timings were exactly accurate. And then I would have these blocks in between, but end up working really long days. But like in the middle of the day, I would, like not have to do any lab work. And so it is kind of confusing. It's like, oh, I feel lazy, but no, I'm actually working like extra. Yeah. But what? Yeah.
And it's actually good to go out of the lab and do something else, because if you want to actually hold 24 hours being in the lab, you need to do something nice, and walk for 30 minutes for your lunch break, or otherwise you're going to go nuts.
Yeah.
So I have one final question, which is, so we've spoken about kind of how science communication was back in the day, what the current really exciting projects are. Where do you think science communicated is headed towards in the future, and what future projects do you have in mind?
So I think it's already headed there, but I feel like science communication, 10 years ago, it wasn't part of the academia system. Let's say if you were doing science communication 10 years ago, when I started Pint of Science, my boss told me I should hide that from my resume. 10 years later, grants are actually asking people to do that. And it's good to put science communication in your resume when you're a scientist. And I think the problem right now is that you you know, like I told you, it's a bit of a chaos because they are asking you to do that, but you don't necessarily have the tools or the time or the money sometimes. So it's getting there. And I think the future, if I'm seeing a very optimistically future, I see that science communicator can work hand to hand with scientists to create projects, and that, you know, thinking about science communication from the start, grants are actually releasing money now more and more for science communication. So you can pay professionals of communication to work with you to think about what you can do as communication. So you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. You can be trained to do it if you want to, but you can also have someone helping you, or doing a podcast, for example, or doing helping you organize events for you and everything. So I feel like we're going towards something where everyone is helping each other, science communicators, academia, scientists. It's just that, and also if you do science communication, it's going to be helpful for your career. And in some places it counts for promotion, in some it doesn't, but they ask you to do that. So it's like, you're asking me to do it, but then you don't care if I do it. So, you know, I think, to be honest, I'm super optimistic about science communication, and I feel like I can't wait to see what's going to happen, because I feel like it can only be good.
That's a perfect place to end today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. And I really hope that our listeners who are scientists can take away from this episode to put in some effort to communicate your science to your friends and anyone you know, and that our non-scientist listeners can have gained some insights into like what the world of science is like.
I would also like to just finish up by saying, if you know of any grants, do send it to us, or if you would like to fund us, we are very open for funding opportunities. You can reach out to us in neuroverse.cc@gmail.com or any of our social media.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us, Elodie. It's been such a pleasure.